What's going on, everyone, and welcome back to another Too Good for Theaters video. Today I'm going to be breaking down three of my favorite prospects if the Sixers were to stick and pick at the number 3 overall selection, so let's get right into it. Let me just start off with saying here that this NBA draft in particular very much reminds me of the NFL draft of the most recent past here. Of course, with having two clear-cut prospects above the rest, that being Cooper Flagg as well as Dylan Harper. And the Sixers kind of find themselves in that third overall range. And really the best course of action for them would be to hope that one of those two potentially drop. Of course, Cooper Flagg is pretty much sealed as the number 1 selection at this time. And I do not believe that the Spurs will kind of pull any kind of crazy move here. And I believe that they will take Dylan Harper. So Sixers really find themselves in that awkward situation where they're going to have their pick of the rest of the prospects. And a lot of the signs really point to Ace Bailey. However, I'm not the biggest of Ace Bailey fans, and my biggest qualm with Ace Bailey, I would say, is I don't think that his game is going to exactly resonate perfectly to the NBA. I think that he's still going to be a very good NBA player. However, I'm not sure if he's going to really hit that star potential that a lot of scouts could potentially recognize him as. And I would say that a lot of people like Ace Bailey because of his difficult shot making as well as his movement shooting. And I think that he has the size and length to be a very good NBA defender. However, what I don't think is going to be able to translate as well as other people think of as Ace Bailey is nothing really comes easy for him. And his greatest quality, which is his difficult shot making, one can also interpret that as his biggest weakness, where he is going to overly rely on his difficult shot making. And there's not a lot of clips that I've seen personally of Ace Bailey breaking down a defender, using his size and maybe bullying someone, or just straight up blowing by a worse athlete than him. No, he'll settle for a contested jumper, a step back, along those lines. And you can really see it through his efficiency in college. There are games where he has high scoring nights of 30 points and where he's on, but there are other nights where he's getting 20 points on 20 shots. And there's a lot of times where his highlights look a lot better than the actual player because of his difficult shot making. And his over-reliance on this, I don't think that a lot of teams are going to have a ton of patience with someone like Ace Bailey, especially when he's not as efficient and he's going to need the ball in his hands to kind of work out some of these kinks and develop as a ball handler. So if he's able to translate his game better to an off-ball player, I think he's going to have more immediate success. Whereas if a franchise really thinks that he's going to be the focal point of an offensive scheme early on, I think that he will struggle adjusting to new NBA defenses and athletes. And I can very much see him being one of these high usage players where they're going to be a quote-unquote shot chucker because they rely so much on contested jump shots. And you have to be so good as one of those players and be more efficient than what Ace Bailey has shown in the past to really be one of those players. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens here with Ace Bailey. I'm not his biggest fan, and I can certainly see why people think that he has superstar potential with his ability of tough shot making. However, I think it's going to be more difficult for that to resonate to the NBA. And I think some of the other prospects here that I'm going to go over have a better chance because they have a more versatile skill set. And maybe they don't have the same quote-unquote star potential as Ace Bailey potentially could have. But I think that they're more of a floor setting, contribute to an NBA team immediately right now. And I think that that's something that the Sixers are more so looking forward to really build around Tyrese Maxey, Paul George, and Joel Embiid right now. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the Sixers kind of approach this NBA draft. And Daryl Morey has never had a pick like this. And, you know, he's trying to gather as much quote-unquote stars as he can get. So typically, you would think that the Sixers would kind of lean towards Ace Bailey. However, I would suggest that they would go look at some of these other prospects that I'm about to go over. Starting off with the most acceptable stick and pick prospect that I have on my list here is probably guard V.J Edgecombe from Baylor, 6'5", combo guard. Someone who can play the point at times, but you really want them more so kind of in that secondary ball handling type role. A guy very similar to one of our hated rivals, Derek White, as well as a guy like an Alex Caruso. I can very much see V.J Edgecombe kind of morphing into one of those players, and those are both very good players. However, do you really want to take one of those players with the 3rd overall pick? And that's why I think a lot of those people kind of point signs to Ace Bailey over guys like this. However, I think that V.J Edgecombe is going to be able to translate really well to the NBA because he just has an NBA body, and he's someone who I can really see guarding 1 through 4 in today's NBA, where he's really going to be able to use his size and his speed to stay with these ones. He has very good lateral quickness, so he can guard 1 through 2. And he even has the size and the wingspan to really contest on some of these larger bodied athletes at the 3 and the 4 that maybe have higher release frames, where he's going to be able to get contest unlike some of the other guards. And he's not going to be able to get shot over very easily by some of the forwards in the league today. So I think that he's someone who can switch extremely well. He had a very good defensive IQ at Baylor, and it's really seen. He has 20 blocks in 30 games from the guard position, which is very impressive, and he averaged 2+ steals. So I think that all that can attribute well to his defensive IQ, as well as just using his athleticism on the defensive end to his advantage. And through those means, I think that that's going to be the most easiest part of his game to really resonate to the NBA. On the offensive side, I think that he is more limited to more so a kind of secondary ball handling type. This isn't someone who you necessarily want to break down a defender and get to the rim. He is a very good finisher around the rim and has shown the ability to have some timely cuts off ball and stuff like that. So I do think that he's best suited for that secondary ball handler role, as I've said before, and can move off ball, timely cuts. Think like Kelly Oubre in terms of a current Sixer, in terms of off ball progress. And I wouldn't say that his shooting is a quote-unquote weakness. However, he is inconsistent at times. However, he has good form, and I believe he had a pretty solid free throw percentage. So that shows the mark of having good form. And he actually shot around 31% in college from the three-point line. So there might be a little bit of a question with expanding his range at the NBA level, but hopefully he's going to be able to really find himself more so in a more standardized catch-and-shoot role compared to what he had as Baylor. So maybe that's something you're relying on if you're a Sixers fan, that since he's going to be more focused off ball, he's going to be able to work more on his catch and shooting and stuff like that. And come playoff time, we see now even in this finals matchup, you don't really want to have guys who are one-dimensional. And this is someone who can attack a weak closeout. And I wouldn't say that you want him breaking down your defender. However, he is someone who can create for himself and get to the lane and finish at a pretty high clip. So I think that V.J. Edgecombe, as long as he's able to consistently knock down his jump shot, I think that he's going to be a fine, serviceable player on the offensive end with elite potential on the defensive end. And that's why he's my favorite prospect that I have picked out on this list. But let's get into some of the other ones as well. The next prospect we're going to be talking about is Texas guard Tre Johnson, 6'6", 2 guard. And I see him really kind of sliding into an explosive six-man role pretty seamlessly. And outside of a guy like Ace Bailey and, of course, Cooper Flagg and Dylan Harper, I think that Tre Johnson probably has the best potential to kind of unlock that quote-unquote star/superstar potential of any of these prospects in this draft, because I really like this ability to score at all three levels, whether it's inside the paint, at the mid-range, or beyond the three-point line. I think that he's effective at all three of those spots, whether it's through crafty finishes and using his body control to really attack on driving lanes, stuff like that, mid-range, and particularly in the pick and roll. I feel like that could be an area where he really thrives at, as well as beyond the three-point line, whether it's just straight up catch and shoot or dribble pull-ups. I think that Tre Johnson probably has the potential to be a top shooter coming out of this draft. But more so, the reason why I like Tre over Con Knipple is Tre's ability to really handle the ball in pick and roll scenarios. And the Sixers don't really have that pick and roll ball handler. I guess you can quote unquote say that Tyrese Maxey is, but he's more so a scoring threat through that scenario. And they don't really have that traditional pick and roll ball handler who can set up a teammate as well as create for themselves in that scenario. And having Joel Embiid, when Joel Embiid is in his quote-unquote prime, or as well as at least healthy and serviceable, I think that Tre Johnson can certainly be a top candidate to run some of those pick-and-roll scenarios with Joel, those pick and pops that really just automatic range for Joel Embiid in that mid-range area. And I'm sure that Tre Johnson can certainly be the beneficiary of some of those assists coming off that pick and roll, especially with his ability to finish around the basket. And I really do think that he can kind of quote-unquote be the, not necessarily that floor general, but be one of those top guys coming off the bench, depending on who you have starting. If Jared McCain is coming off the bench alongside Tre Johnson, that's a really good shooting backcourt where either one of them can really handle the ball and create for others there. However, I do think that Tre Johnson is probably the better ball handler of Jared McCain as well as himself. And I really do like Jared McCain coming in that off-ball role, especially with his movement shooting. But Tre Johnson is certainly one of those guys who you can also pair alongside Jared McCain just because of his height, 6'6". Not that Tre Johnson's necessarily a great defender by any means. However, he does have the tool set to be a better defender than I would say he was at Texas, especially with all the dysfunction there. From a freshman, he had a very successful season. However, I do think that all the struggle kind of weighed down on him. And I do think that his defense was impacted by the losing as well as all the turmoil. And it was noticeable on the defensive end compared to the offensive end. And there were times where Tre Johnson looked frustrated without the ball in his hands. So it's going to be interesting to see if he can really adapt to that kind of off ball. I'm not the focal point of the offense on the Sixers, given the amount of talent around him. And a lot of the concerns I have with Ace Bailey also kind of translate over here to Tre Johnson. However, while I'm higher on Tre Johnson is just his ability to be a knockdown, catch and shoot type player. I think that he's probably the best three-point shooter in this draft class. So I think that can certainly resonate well to the NBA. And all my concerns are mostly whether it's mentality or just on the defensive end. And I think you could excuse a lot of the issues that I had with Tre Johnson just based on being on a losing team in Texas and, frankly, a lot of dysfunction from the coaching staff and really just the way that Texas played. And it certainly was shown through Tre Johnson's defense, whether it was napping off ball and stuff like that, not being in the right passing lane, failing to really kind of rotate and pick up an offensive player, stuff like that. That I think that Nick Nurse and hopefully the Sixers will be able to kind of quote-unquote coach out of him or coach into him to be in the proper spots on defense and hopefully harness a little bit of his natural body ability on the defensive end to become a better defender. The last potential prospect I want to talk about here is BYU's Egor Demin, and this would certainly be considered a reach at the 3rd overall selection and would most likely be a trade-back candidate, but I like Egor a lot because he brings a little bit of a different skill set that these past couple Sixers teams have not necessarily had, probably since James Harden was the last, and that is a true bona fide playmaker. And what I mean by that is someone who can get people in the sets in the half court, make the proper play, whether it's off ball through hockey assists or as a primary ball handler in the pick and roll offense and playing downhill. He's able to get guys and generate open looks for others on the perimeter. And I would say that in particular, especially with the Sixers team, this is a guy who has height as a passer. And really since Ben, we haven't had someone who's really to throw the ball over the defense down into Joe. And at times, that's where Joe has found his struggles in trying to get proper positioning. When he actually does get good steal positioning, a lot of guys on the team aren't actually able to feed him the ball down there because they can't see over the defender and they're not gifted as a playmaker. But that would certainly not be an issue with Egor. I think that would certainly help Joel a lot. It would help the Sixers offense. And when I'm talking about a floor general, at times last year, I felt like it was just give the ball to Joe, Maxey, or PG and really just let them try to work in isolation scoring. And there wasn't a lot of team basketball. But with Egor, this is a guy who you can base your offense around where he can really put the ball in any type of place on the court so you can run actions for him. You can run sets for others, guys like pin down screens, coming off screens. And Egor's certainly going to be able to find him. And I would say that the biggest weakness of Egor is probably certainly his outside shooting. And it really does compare a lot to Ben Simmons. He does remind me of him. However, he's not as reluctant of an outside shooter as Ben is. I believe he got up around 5 attempts in college last year, so he's certainly willing to put them up. Unfortunately, he only made around 27% of those shots. So that is certainly the biggest area in which Egor has to develop in. And if he's going to see the floor early, especially with the starters, that's going to be an area of improvement he needs to focus upon because the Sixers are going to want to have as much spacing around guys like Joe, PG, McCain, and Maxey as possible for them to work to their fullest capacity. And I really do see Egor as being maybe that first or second guy off the bench who really runs the second unit and at times can play short stints with the starters and kind of relieve the pressure off of guys like Tyrese Maxey to create for others and allow him to play at his best when he is strictly just a pure scorer. So that is why I like Egor a lot. But I do understand that this would be a bit of a reach as the 3rd overall selection. So it's going to be very interesting to see what the Sixers do if they decide to stick with the 3rd overall selection. All right, everyone, that's going to wrap up this video here. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below on who you believe the Sixers should take 3rd overall. I am going to be making some more draft content video in the next coming days. Understandably, the draft is on Wednesday, so I will have to push some of that out. However, I'm going to be going over some possible trade back candidates, guys like Carter Bryant, as well as Colin Murray Boyles. So I look forward to seeing you in those videos as well. And once again, thank you so much for watching.